Hi everyone, you guys able to hear me okay? Great, thank you. All right, so let's get started. Course logistics. First of all, please accept my apologies. Exam 2 is still being graded. I am working as fast as I can to get those all finished up. They're just not quite there yet, so I'll keep doing that today, and I should have them to you before we meet again. I'm sorry about that. I had a bunch of things come up in our lab, and we had to do some demos, so had to get a little bit sidetracked there. But we'll get your exam 2s back as soon as I can. Also, we will have coming up for the project the second checkpoint, and what I'm going to do is I'll post it as an assignment on Canvas later this evening, and I'll just it'll be just a few questions for you to answer, basically about the status of your project, and then a field for you to submit your latest prototype, and that'll be due on Monday. So I'll post that this evening, and if you have questions about it, we can talk about it when we meet on Thursday. Also, just a quick reminder, if you are a grad student, got the graduate lit review that'll be due by the end of the semester, so the day of our final. So if you haven't taken a look at that assignment, please take a look soon, and let me know if you have questions about that, and that way you can get started on it. It's not a huge assignment, but it will take you a little while. So it's definitely not something you want to put off until a few days before or anything like that. So please take a look so that you at least know if you have questions, and if so, send those to me, and I'll get your answers on that, and then please get started on that so that you can be sure to have that done in time. All right, so looking at our semester timeline, we are here on the green. Today we're doing Cybersecurity and HCI. So yesterday you had Quiz 7 and Reflection 7 due, and we'll talk about Reflection 7. I'll incorporate that into Thursday's lecture, which is a bit of a special topic lecture. Oh, okay, we have a question. To provide some example topics to look at for the graduate assignment. Yeah, I can do that. So I will, I'll put together a couple of examples and post that for you. I'll do that after class. Let me make a note. And that way you'll have some examples. So yeah, no problem. I mean, the main thing you want to do is you want to pick something that's not too broad, so you don't want to pick like, multi-touch interactions, because there's just like a million of them. But you don't want it to be too narrow, so you kind of want something in between. But yeah, I'll post some examples. So we'll talk about the stuff that you posted in Reflection 7 when we do special topic on Thursday about HCI as it relates to presidential election in the US, kind of everything involved with that. And then you can see we've kind of got all of our due dates aligned on these Mondays for the rest of the semester. So that's what our future looks like for the course. And I will, this project checkpoint, that's the checkpoint 2 that's coming up, and I will be posting the details this evening, so they'll be available to you in here. It shouldn't take you too long it'll just be a couple of questions about where your project's at and what you plan to do for your evaluation. It's just mainly to give me a sense of if anybody needs to kind of, if I need to give anybody any important feedback before we head into the final checkpoint. I want to get that to you as soon as possible. Exam 3 won't be on a Tuesday like the others. We could do that. I've kind of just aligned the due dates here, but we can we could look at pushing that a little bit further if that's helpful. We'll talk about it, I guess, when we get a little bit closer, somewhere the 5th or 10th, somewhere in there. But yeah, we can look at pushing it a little bit later if we need to do that. Okay, so that's kind of our outlook for right now. Is it supposed to be November 9th and not the 26th? Yeah, that's a good point there. Yes, that would be November 9th. Copy and paste, man. So yeah, thank you. Good catch. So that is November 9th there. All right, I'll fix that as well. Okay, so last time we talked about AI and machine learning and how that relates to HCI. So just to kind of recap that, we talked about AI being this broad moving target. We kind of looked at these different areas of AI that traditionally exist, how the field's divided, and then we kind of focused in on learning, machine learning specifically, looking at algorithms that we could feed a bunch of data to and have them kind of build their own logic, and then we could use them to classify things or make predictions on new data sets. So we talked about some different areas of machine learning. We talked about how not all machine learning is equal in terms of the consequences of a false positive or a false negative. So we talked about there being differences in maybe the threshold value for something like Hey Siri or Alexa, because that's going to initiate a process where the voice assistant is going to first of all capture audio and send that somewhere. So that's a little bit of a privacy concern. But also then it's typically going to respond, and if it's not, if the user didn't mean to activate the voice assistant, then they'll be a little bit frustrated or surprised to hear from it. And then we kind of looked at some other extreme examples where you have your machine learning that's doing safety critical things or kind of life altering things. So we had the example of the self-driving autonomous vehicles, things like some of Tesla's kind of assistive features that it sells as autopilot. And then we looked at the case of Uber and colliding with a pedestrian and actually killing a pedestrian because of the choices they made with their machine learning algorithms and with their approach to safety there. And then we briefly mentioned that things, as serious as prosecuting someone for a crime, maybe with some results coming from some machine learning system. More and more, that tends to be facial recognition systems, which are full of problems and biases. And so that's definitely an area we see people concerned about, a lot of people, with good reason. And it's something that we have to think about and be careful about when we start to apply technologies to things like this. And then we started to kind of touch on kind of where we see AI and machine learning being used the most right now in terms of HCI. So we talked about input mechanisms, so things like gesture recognition, maybe things like tracking your eyes and where you're looking, using machine learning to personalize things, customize things, and then we talked about kind of the difficulties with incorporating those designs, or incorporating machine learning and AI into your designs. So how do you evaluate that? How do you explain kind of the outcome of it? And it's not an easy thing to do in a lot of cases. And how do you design to accommodate that? So specifically, some of the input devices that we talked about here, some of the popular ones. And then we also talked about using this to model the user, personalize things, some of the common uses there. We mentioned things like Netflix, for example, will use a bootstrapping approach for a new user. So they'll try to, they'll ask you, and a lot of systems do this, but Netflix was one of the early ones to do this. They'll ask you to choose from a set of movies, ones that you like or don't like, and they'll use that to match you up with a user that they've had in their system for a long time to help make those early predictions for you and recommendations. And we talked a little bit about anticipatory design, so the idea that we could use AI or machine learning to get an idea of the user's context. A lot of times it's done with either their mobile device or smart home devices are pretty common now, to kind of get a sense of where the user is, where they might be going, and anticipate their needs. Yeah, there we go. So one of the terms that gets thrown around there is ambient intelligence. So predicting the information that'll be helpful for a user. And we certainly see this on a lot of mobile operating systems today, where they kind of choose the shortcuts or even pop up with a suggestion based on some of the data that they've collected and the algorithms processing that. And then we talked about some of the challenges that we still have with AI and machine learning and HCI, still being a relatively new thing, I guess, in terms of computing and in terms of HCI specifically. Having machine learning and AI available in easy ways, kind of as easy as an API call in most cases, is relatively new. So still a lot of exciting work going on there, and a lot of standards being set. So we talked about helping the user understand kind of what the AI is doing, why and when and what to expect from it, and managing any uncertainty or any unexpected output for the AI. And so we talked about maybe doing common sense checks on things to make sure if the AI does something that's not rational necessarily, that we handle that. And then we mentioned that AI can be good and bad in kind of all of these applications is just listed as examples, but you can find good aspects and bad aspects of using AI and machine learning in each of these applications. So today we're going to focus for a little bit on cybersecurity and HCI. So this is a kind of an interesting subfield of HCI, and there's not really a ton of I guess ready and packaged resources out there if you go look for this. So you won't find a textbook or really very many books even that focus specifically on kind of the HCI aspects of cybersecurity. And I should say we're also going to talk about privacy, which goes hand in hand with security. So I will say that a lot of this material I've used some of the figures and some of just the ideas and organization from this course at Carnegie Mellon. And so here's the link to that. They've got a lot of their material posted. If you're interested in this, definitely check it out. It's a full class about this, and we'll just have this one lecture today about it. But if you're interested in this area, it's sometimes called usable privacy and security. And so this is a great course here to look at if you're interested in that. All right. So kind of the first thing we want to think about as we approach security and privacy is to realize that these two are really closely related. They're not exactly the same, but a lot of the kind of design aspects of it and the things we do to meet one goal will oftentimes meet the other goal, or it's a good approach for both of them in a lot of cases, and we'll see that as we talk about each area today. So I mentioned this term usable security, and this is one of the probably one of the more popular terms if you wanted to search for stuff about kind of usability, HCI, user experience, and as that relates to security and privacy. This is probably one of the terms you would want to look at. And So the idea here is that you're looking at more than just basic usability of a system and more than just basic security of a system. So you're looking at these two aspects together. And what you might not think about initially is that this includes a pretty big area of design in terms of when you design a system, a piece of software or hardware. When you start to think about security and privacy, you need to start to think about adversaries and risk. And that's not something that we always think about when we go to solve a problem or design a system. And we've got to really fight the urge to do that later. So kind of one of the major principles is that you need to think about security and privacy from the beginning when you start to build a system. So the goals being, in terms of security, is that you want to stay secure and usable in all of these circumstances. So you want to assume that the user might be the subject of an attack, but you want your system to be usable and secure throughout that. You want to remember that users will always, for the most part, choose the path of least resistance. They're looking for convenience. They want to get things done. And so they will make choices based on that and not necessarily on security principles or privacy principles. You've also got to remember that users don't exist in a static state. Their world is dynamic. They may be in higher or lower stress situations day to day. And people are distracted sometimes. We make mistakes. That's expected. But we need to consider that as we consider how do we design for security and privacy. So a couple of terms I just want to cover that you're probably familiar with, but we'll just kind of lay them out formally here. And these are more about security. So the first one's confidentiality. And kind of a principle of confidentiality is that information is only disclosed to those who are authorized to access it. So that's one principle of a secure system that we typically want to maintain. Integrity is another one. So we want the system and the data to be correct and consistent, so not tampered with or corrupted. We want to know that it's reliable and accurate in terms of the data that it stores and presents. And availability. So this is a big one when we think about some common attacks that happen. We want a system that is available to the user, that the user can use it and within a reasonable amount of time, as they would expect, even when we're defending against attackers. A couple more terms to keep in mind. So secrecy, this would be keeping data hidden. Privacy is, you can think of this as sharing data but following a rule set as we share the data and allow people to access it. It's according to a set of rules. And anonymity, keeping the identity of a person or a user secret. So this comes up sometimes in systems. So just a few fundamentals to think about. So we can kind of look at, when we start to think about security and usability and where those two come together. This is a kind of a nice table that lays this out. And this is from the Usable Privacy and Security course. So if we look at this first column and we think about just security, we would think that the usability, user experience would be secondary to keeping things secure and maintaining those principles we talked about. In terms of how do we think about humans, we primarily think about them in their role as possibly being a risk. We would think about different threat models in terms of protecting data. We would focus a lot on actual security metrics, and user studies are a bit complicated in terms of when we look at security and usability. But when we're looking at just straight up security, we don't always really need to do user studies in the way we think about them in HCI. We might do some kind of scripted verification of systems. We might have some automated attacks that are attacking our system to verify that it's safe. But in terms of an actual user, that might be more rare. Now, if we think about just HCI, which is kind of what we've been talking about this whole semester, we don't think about security as much. We think about the user's experience, the usability of the system. We're not really concerned about attackers. We're thinking about the user that we're designing for and what errors they make and how we can help prevent that. We're thinking about the user's mental models, how they are processing the information, and how our system meshes with that. And again, we're focused on evaluating usability metrics and maybe some user experience metrics as well. And we do a lot of user studies, whether those are informal or formal. It's pretty common. So when we kind of mix these two together, so you get your nice blue, red, purple when you mix them together, we start to see that we've got to balance both of these things. We've got to consider both of these things. And it's easy to think that these are pitted against each other, but that's not always the case. And we kind of have to argue that truly good design and truly usable, secure system can promote both of these goals. So it's not a trade-off between one or the other. That's not to say that that's an easy thing to do, or that we even have the answer in terms of doing that for a lot of things. So we've got to think about kind of double the territory here as we start to merge usability and security together. And I should say, when we think about security, we should always think about privacy being right there with it. So I think if you could take one thing away from this as you start to think about doing usable security or privacy and kind of good HCI in terms of keeping things secure, you've got to think about a user's mental model. And that's really where the key is. And I think when we see, and we'll talk about a lot of different things in terms of security and that have failed in terms of being very usable, I think a lot of where they fall short is that the user doesn't have a mental model necessarily of the security process. And if you can get the user to a point where they have a mental model of that, where they understand where they fit in to that, then your job becomes a lot easier, their experience becomes a lot better, and hopefully your system stays a lot more secure, and you also do a good job of protecting the user's privacy. So as we start to think about the mental models, kind of some of the key questions that we need to, and these are questions for us, but we need to convey this to our users. What's being protected? How are we protecting it? How would the user know if there's a problem with that protection? And so they need a way to map whatever abstraction it is of information or assets that they're protecting, map that to the system and to their actions and what they do to be part of that process. So this is I'm going to talk about a few points from kind of an older paper from 1999, but definitely an important one, discussing why usable security and privacy is difficult. So let's go through a few points here. And so these are different properties that were presented in this paper, and they're very important today. And you can definitely think about applying these to systems you use today. So the first one is an unmotivated user property. Users don't really buy devices or software or anything with the intention of managing security. No one, purchases a phone and is excited about the updates, really. I mean, most of us aren't. But that's not the primary purpose that we we get these systems. So to a user, you kind of already start off as being a secondary task, which is not good. The next principle is abstraction, or the next property is the abstraction property. And this is an important idea. This is about security policies and kind of the abstract rules that get applied to things. And a lot of this is automatic in a system, and a user may have no idea really how this emerges. And so we'll find that the more we can connect a user with that process and make them aware and involved in setting policies and understanding policies, the better their mental model will be and the better overall security will be. The next property is the lack of feedback. So feedback's really critical. We've learned that in kind of every design that we've done. You want to give feedback to the user. But it can be difficult when we talk about security and privacy to provide the right amount of feedback at the right time and do it in a meaningful way. And occasionally it's at odds to provide detailed feedback with the goals of security, right? So we might not want to say too much to someone that would give them information that would help them compromise the system. The next property is the barn door property. And that's kind of just a fundamental security fact, and that's that once something is unprotected, once we realize it's vulnerable, we have no idea necessarily who accessed it and where it exists today. So it's kind of, once we've got a compromise, that's a big problem. And then, of course, the weakest link property. So if you're an attacker, you only need to really exploit one problem in the system. You only usually need to find one entry point and work from there. And so while we have to design kind of for everything, for the user, for usability, user experience, the attacker just has to find one weakness. So it's a little bit unbalanced there. So let's talk about why usable security and privacy research is difficult. And when I say research, I also mean design of systems. So when you're developing and designing a system, why is that a difficult thing? First one is interdisciplinary work. So you've got HCI, you've got people from the privacy field, whether that's legal or ethical. You've also got just straight up security, cybersecurity, information security people. And you've got to integrate all of this together. Always a challenge, no matter what it is. You also got a challenge of familiarity. And so that's kind of an interesting thing, is that we design security for devices that we use today. And we're all, commonly using them. And it kind of limits the way that we think about them. And it doesn't help that a lot of the best solutions, the best secure solutions, they appear obvious after we've found them. So that can be a little bit difficult in terms of, progressing this field. We have an interrelation challenge. So there is this complex interaction between usability and security, and we talked about that. That it's not always a trade-off, but sometimes it is. And so for example, a kind of a common, example you can think of is when you go to log into a system, right, and say you need a username and a password. Typically, a secure system will not tell you which one of those is wrong if you log in with a wrong combination. It won't say, oh yeah, that username is right, but the password's wrong, because that's kind of can be harmful to security, right? That confirms that the account exists. But from a feedback sense, a usability sense, it would be great to be able to tell the user that the username is wrong. And I think a lot of us have probably experienced this, where we have to go through that process of identifying what the username is and then the password. And it can be quite frustrating. There's also a big challenge in evaluating security. So one of the primary things that we take for granted with just regular usable systems is that we can ask a user what they like, what they don't like. We can measure if things were efficient, usable, memorable, learnable, all of those things. But users don't typically know how to evaluate the security of a system, and they don't know how to evaluate their own behavior in terms of security. So we kind of lose that data point, getting that feedback from the user when we evaluate things. And related to that is this ecological validity challenge. So when we want to test a system for security and usability, we get into this weird area of, if we tell a user that they're part of a test, they kind of heighten their vigilance for security issues. So when we do that, they may not be behaving the way they're probably going to behave when they're actually attacked, or when they're actually in a security situation. And then we also get into a little bit of an ethical kind of problem, in terms of, if we try to go test this out in the wild or something, we run into legal issues, security issues, privacy issues. So it's really a more involved process, and there's a lot to balance. And then we've also got to think about modeling the adversary, right? We've got to think about how that bad actor will behave, and we need to understand user perceptions of different threats. And so that's its own layer of challenges there. Another thing that we often have to face is that technology changes quickly, right? And security and privacy are pretty fundamental to a lot of the things that we use every day. And so if we're working to push the field forward and design new things or research new things, we've got to keep pace with those real systems that are being developed. You can't just develop something on some old system or some toy system, and then that be a useful contribution necessarily. And then finally, kind of one of the more important aspects of this, when we think about security and privacy just in products that we use, who's the customer for security and privacy? And so you can think, oh, well, yeah, the user is the customer, but who has the real interest in this? And ultimately, in a lot of cases, who's going to pay to focus on developing these security and privacy systems? And that gets into where people think of security and privacy being a secondary goal. So let's think a little bit more about threat models. So one thing that's important when you're designing a system is to realize that in a lot of cases it's going to be impossible to protect everything. There's going to be some cost-benefit trade-off at some point. We can't run everything in an extreme way, and as our systems get more and more complex and integrate with more and more other systems, there are a lot of little places where we can have compromises and vulnerabilities. So oftentimes we do need to set out with a goal of not having that happen and have aggressive plans to prevent it, but we also need plans for how we respond to that, how we recognize that, and contain it as we go. So kind of early on, when you're thinking about the problem space and working on your system, you've got to think about attackers and the mechanisms they're going to use. And this differs based on the system that you're making and the domain that you're in. You've got to think about who the attackers are, kind of what their resources are, and you've got to think about how much does this matter to you? How much does it matter to the users? What are the consequences if you're compromised? And that will shape a lot of the design that you use and the approach that you use. So thinking like an attacker, so an adversary will target assets, typically data in the system, or access to a system to use it. They don't think about the defenses, so they're just trying to get in. And like a user, an adversary will take the path of least resistance. So in a lot of cases, this ends up being a social engineering approach to things. So maybe that's bribing someone, maybe that's tricking someone into thinking that you're authorized to do something, or that you're calling from some telecommunications company and you need a SIM swapped or something. this is where we see a lot of successful attacks kind of take root, is in a social engineering domain. So that's something to think about as we design our products. And then just straight up, physical theft is great. That's effective, right? So if someone's really motivated and they can just grab a hard drive that's got unencrypted data on it or something, that's often the path of least resistance. So we can kind of split attackers into two categories, just broadly. So we can think about passive and active. So passive attackers may breach a system, may have access to it, and may kind of just watch and not interfere with what's going on, but observe and maybe copy what's occurring in the protected area. Whereas an active attacker is going to manipulate the system, maybe corrupt data, maybe change data, and serve some need that way. When we also think about attackers, and we kind of talked about this just a second ago, thinking about their skill level, their resources, motivation, and what they know about the system or the domain or the user. And this is kind of important because some attackers are more common than others. If the barrier to entry is knowing the street that the user grew up on when they were a kid, probably a lot of people meet that criteria or can find that information out. Here's a question. How would you train a person in social engineering? I know that people call and act like the user, but how would you counter it? So that's a great question. And there's a lot of research on this. One of the most common approaches, obviously, is training. So training, people who are going to take those kinds of calls on what's suspicious, what to look for. But that's really not very effective, honestly. And so we kind of move to more formalized systems of authentication and proving that you have authority to do something, but that's tough because that requires a lot of work and a lot of overhead, especially if it's different companies with systems that aren't connected or something. So you've kind of got to balance things. You can certainly do approaches, some automated approaches like auditing logs, looking for odd behaviors, outlying events, and trying to, we'll talk about this a little bit, propagating kind of that information, maybe even visually to dashboards or to automated systems that will trigger further investigation of things. But it's a tough area. And we see a lot of clever attacks with social engineering. So that's a great question. So as we think about the attackers, we also have to distinguish between, just people who are individuals acting, or as far as nation-state actors that have some motivation. So the resources vary quite a bit between those. We also have to think about the different things that we might be protecting. So this is an example of, this is a implantable device, pacemaker kind of device. And as we think about something like this, we need to, first of all, what are the risks if an attacker, a malicious actor, gains access? Well, they could kill somebody. And we also got to think about the functionality that this thing has to have. It can't be completely isolated because, for example, it needs to have a way to be disabled before surgeries because you don't want it to deliver shocks whenever a patient's under anesthesia and under hospital care, right? That would be that would interfere with their care, and it would be harmful or dangerous to the people caring for them. So these devices do have a way to signal to disable them for that. You also need to be able to provide access to the telemetry data, to the data these devices are collecting, because that's very important and helpful when you're providing care to a patient that has one of these. And you often want to transmit that remotely. So this is, kind of a high stakes, physical device here. But we've got to think about legitimate uses and how do we also defend against attacks. So, it's kind of just to make you think that there are a lot of different areas that you apply security to. So let's take a look in a little bit of detail at passwords. So passwords have been kind of an area of security design that just stretches all the way back. So here's this quote about passwords: security at minimal inconvenience, from a 1979 kind of classic paper. So just right off the bat, some of the problems that we see with passwords is that, giving feedback can be difficult. We talked about that, username being wrong versus password being wrong. We see this question of what makes a strong password. And then kind of what do users think makes a strong password? So there's lots of bad advice out there about what a good password might be. And we can certainly answer a question like this from a technical perspective. We can think about it from how we would attack a password and give you an answer that way. But that's not going to be necessarily a usable solution for a human. It's not going to be enjoyable to use or easy to use. So let's think about password policies. We've all dealt with systems that have very specific requirements for passwords that are annoying, right? So maybe it's a specific length requirement plus, this many uppercase characters, this many numbers, this many symbols, this many lowercase. Maybe it's even worse than that. Maybe they're forbidding some characters for some reason for being used in a password. Whatever the case is, because we have so many systems that use passwords, we run into this problem of a user being overwhelmed and unable to remember how to meet all of those requirements for every system that they use. Now we add on to that when a user reuses a password, that's problematic from a security perspective, because if they get breached in one place, then they're kind of breached everywhere. So weakest link principle there. But users will attempt to use the same password everywhere because they need to remember it. And then kind of one of the other classic problems that we've seen with passwords is this idea of requiring frequent password changes. So the idea being that we want to mitigate, if your account was compromised, say, as long as we change your password every 30 days, well, whoever had the old one, the idea was that they won't get the new one and they'll be locked out. That turns out not to really be helpful. So I believe it's no longer recommended by NIST to have these password rotation or expiration policies. It focus more on developing a strong password and monitoring the user's activity and letting them know if something weird is going on, if there's access happening that shouldn't be, and also using multi-factor authentication. We'll talk about that. But in general, another problem with this is that if a user's password is compromised, it may be as simple as there's a keylogger somewhere, and so when you rotate the password, they're just going to get the new password. The user's going to have a hard time remembering it. You can impose all these crazy policies, and it'll really frustrate them and cause them to, act in an insecure way. An interesting area of kind of approach to passwords to trying to make them more usable, which has been an effort that we've been at for a long time, is the idea of a graphical password. So here's an example of drawing on a grid, and that being translated into some string that can be evaluated as a password. We see a classic example of this in the Android operating system early on, the unlock patterns, kind of a gesture on a grid to unlock the phone, making a passcode. You can also have gestures that are just in free space, so not in a grid necessarily. Or you can do kind of drawing on a picture, so the user knows the landmarks based on the picture. So Windows has a picture login that works like this, which is actually pretty useful. I use it on my Surface still, and it's pretty convenient, kind of nice. These aren't that secure. That's kind of what we should say here, is that the space, the key space of the password is limited, right? Because like in this case, you've got discrete regions of this grid. How many combinations are there of that? And turns out people kind of do predictable things with gestures. We can come up with a dictionary of gestures, just like we have a dictionary of words that we use to crack passwords. We can do the same thing with gestures. The good part is that a lot of these graphical passwords are kind of used as shortcuts, right? For example, on Windows, like my account has a password, and I have some criteria for when I can use the graphical password as a shortcut to get through that, but I can have it time out if I'd like, so that I have to enter the actual password. And we see this on mobile devices as well. So here's kind of when we think about those areas of security, HCI, and then usable security. And we think about it in terms of graphical passwords. We can look at the security aspects, thinking about like the space of possible passwords. How do we make it harder to guess? How do we store the passwords is another question. You saw it translated to a string earlier. How do we securely store that? That's a security question, right? And then, can we prevent someone who's an attacker from observing the user input this gesture to bypass it? On the usability side, gestures are pretty useful, right? Because they can be quick, they're more memorable, quicker to learn. It's kind of, the user can automatically do it in a lot of cases once they start to use it. But we also might think about how do we do this in an accessible way. So if you have different impairments, whether that's a visual impairment or a motor skill impairment, how would we implement a graphical password in that case? A little bit more difficult there. And then we kind of merge these together. So we can start to think about what's the usability of different password input methods. How can we merge that with the kind of the ideas of security and key space and making it actually secure? And then maybe how do we decide when we're going to allow that to be used or not used? Maybe we can make a trade-off there. Here's an example of a system called Passfaces. And so in this case, in addition to a password, the user knows one of these faces is kind of familiar to them. They learn it as part of their authentication, and they have to choose it from the grid. And this is dynamically generated every time. And we see a lot of systems similar to this. This is not foolproof, right? If you observe them picking the face, or if you observe enough interactions with this, you can kind of solve it. But it's not the only factor. Another area that's kind of interesting to look at, and I've just pulled a figure that shows quite a few of them, and this is back in 2012, but gets the point across. Kind of looking at this idea of password meters and strength indicators, and there are a lot of approaches to this, so I think we've all seen most of these probably. So you can see these are what some of the bigger systems were using at the time, and the idea being kind of aiding the user in making a secure password by giving them this indicator. So that may or may not be a good idea. And a lot of the question is, how do we measure what a good password is, and what's the best approach to that? And there are a lot of factors to consider there. But this is kind of a nice, incorporation of feedback into the interface, right? As the user's creating a password. You want to do it appropriately. You don't want to jump in immediately and get aggressive when they've typed one character in. And you kind of would want to give tips that are helpful. And this all depends on you being able to evaluate the password in a good way. So this is a big area to look at. So here's kind of a classic XKCD comic about password generation. And so thinking about, you'll probably find a lot of people who feel that this is a secure thing to do, right? To kind of, substitute numbers for letters, make sure you get a symbol in there. But it kind of turns out that computers are okay with guessing things like this. It's not that bad. So the comic suggests choosing a random phrase as a password instead, and showing that would be difficult to guess. This is somewhat true, but somewhat not true. This is certainly a good approach as long as the attacker doesn't realize this is your approach. So we kind of have the problem of we use specific language, and we can enumerate a lot of possibilities in terms of if we're just using like lowercase English words here. So you might need to spice it up a little bit more than this. But in general, something like this in a brute force attack will be harder to compromise than something like this. So, that's something to think about when you're setting password policies. I wanted to show this just briefly. This is from a 2012 Lit review about different password approaches and comparing them to just classic passwords. And this is this huge table where they're evaluating all these factors, and I'll zoom in a little bit, how they kind of stack up across these different approaches to passwords and authentication. And so you can look at this when I post the slides if you're interested. But essentially, kind of the finding here is that even looking at a dozen or so different approaches, one of the main problems is deploying some of these new approaches into older systems. It tends to be kind of a problem, whereas a classic password is supported. So let's talk about password managers a little bit, because that would seem to solve a lot of our problems with users generating a secure password and not having to remember it necessarily like a trust the password manager. So just want to mention kind of these, just divided this into 4 categories of password managers. So the first one just being client-based, which is basic password manager, like typically on a desktop computer, stores your passwords in an encrypted file. It's encrypted with a master password. Usually it's a browser extension to help you, conveniently fill things in. There's a lot of room for exploitation here. We certainly see a lot of examples of this where password managers, sure, they encrypted things securely and that's all, guarded well, but then there's some vulnerability with maybe what they respond to in the browser that allows them to be attacked. So it's not a trivial thing. We also see these on mobile devices, in a similar way to these client-based devices. A lot of these pretty much modern password managers are cloud-based. They have online features, so that adds in the attack surface of making sure that this encrypted file is good enough to be, put out on the internet and possibly obtained by someone who wants to attack it. And then kind of this interesting approach down here that I just wanted to mention is the idea of using there were password managers that would use their single master password, take a hash of that, and then append the domain that they're authenticating to, and use a hashing scheme there as well to create a unique password. But they didn't really need to store anything because of the way that's done. So kind of interesting to think about. Not ideal from a security perspective necessarily, but clever. So let's talk about making accessing things a little bit easier. So we've got let's say our long password. A lot of shortcuts that we see today, especially on mobile devices, rely on some form of biometrics. I didn't put Face ID in here. So facial recognition is kind of a common one right now. We see things like fingerprint sensors kind of embedded in the screens of phones or in the buttons or wherever. They're really fast. We also have systems that'll do voice recognition or eye scans. Those are a little bit less common. But kind of what we want to think about here is we can think about the biometric as being a shortcut. I think that's the best way to think about it. And that, you might say, why would I want to give this shortcut? Because it's typically, if it's a PIN or a biometric, it's a smaller key space. It's easier to brute force to attack, right? But if you consider that many users, if you only offered them the option of a full password, they would rather disable the password altogether, then biometrics and PINs are better than nothing. And so they really do kind of bridge a gap of, convenience and security. One of the things that is helpful with biometrics and PINs is that typically you need physical access to the device. So they're usually used for things where physical access is the first barrier, and that is a barrier. So you wouldn't have these just on a public web-facing system or something, right? You wouldn't want to open it up to that kind of attack. So it's better than nothing. And should say that when you think about these systems, you do have to think about the error rates in terms of like recognizing a fingerprint or a face, and kind of what's allowable and what's desirable there. So let's talk about multi-factor authentication. So this is where a lot of things are today, and this is a good way to solve kind of the password problem. It's not a perfect solution in terms of usability because it adds a step. So the user has to spend a little bit longer. I would argue that people are getting better at this. They're adapting to it. They're getting used to it. So it's not that big of a deal. And it does provide a great security benefit. So for multi-factor authentication, we're typically talking about a password plus something else. Traditionally, kind of the earliest things, we had hardware tokens, like physical dedicated devices that might generate a code based on time or iteration, and you would supply that code in addition to the password. Now we see things like mobile apps that do this, like Google has the Authenticator app that's pretty popular, so it just generates codes. They're time-based, that you when you register for a service, you scan a QR code to set it up so that it can generate the proper codes for your account, and then you use that to log in. We also see just text messaging used for this, so sending you a code over text message. That's not perfect, subject to a lot of attacks on the phone system, but maybe better than nothing. And I should say now we also see hardware tokens that do challenge-based authentication. So things like YubiKeys, so just little USB devices, or maybe NFC or even Bluetooth, that are a physical thing that the user possesses. They can insert into the machine or get it within proximity and then press the button to produce a response to a challenge to prove that they have possession of that device. So the two common types, we see time-based generation, like we see that in a lot of mobile apps, and then we see challenge-based authentication, and we see that with a lot of hardware keys that we use today. Here's kind of an interesting one. This is a system called GridSure system. And the idea is that people are better at memorizing or remembering patterns. So the idea is that you would have like this 5x5 grid, and you might remember that your pattern is like this ABCD in this order, right? And then when you log in, you'd be presented with a grid of random digits, and you would enter 7, 8, 3, 4. And because you know your pattern, it's easy for you to pick these out, not necessarily so easy for someone to understand what pattern you were picking from. You see like there's multiple 7s and 9s and 4s and everything. So this is not amazing in terms of security. If you watch enough of these, you can figure it out. This one's a little bit of a more advanced version of that, or more involved version of that, I should say, that asks the user to do some transformations and some math on this. So we see a lot of systems like this, adding a factor in addition to a password typically. So when we start to do things like this, and just with passwords in general, we have problems with fallback authentication. So that's what do we do if the user forgets their password or loses their multi-factor, or drops their phone in the ocean and doesn't have a backup? So we have to have a way to get them back in. And a lot of times we do that in terms of, traditionally security questions, which are horrible because that's very easy to figure out the answer to in a lot of cases. Another popular way of doing this was to take the user's phone number and fall back to authenticating through it. That's not great either. We saw recent Twitter hacks, for example, like just this year, this recent, people using spoofing and using SMS systems to take control of accounts. And we also see this idea of backup codes. I know I have a lot of backup codes, and these are, physical, this kind of a block of numbers, and like Google or whoever will tell you, print this out and keep it somewhere safe. Don't store it digitally. Don't do any of that. My first problem is always I don't always have a printer, so you've got to remember where that's stored. You've got to protect it. That's a problem. So there's no perfect solution here. Some interesting things you could do, sometimes if you have like a community of users, you can fall back on other users that know the user who's lost their credentials to vouch for them, but that doesn't really scale always. So this is still an open area of kind of investigation. So a lot of the common practice today is redundancy. So like when you register a YubiKey, like a hardware token with Google or someone, they usually encourage you to register multiple, a backup one, and put that one somewhere safe. So if you lose your primary, you can hopefully get to your backup. So let's briefly talk about encryption. So it's kind of a big part of protecting data. So two core ideas, secrecy and authenticity. So in this case, in this example, secrecy, only Bob can decrypt messages for Bob, and authenticity, the message that I got actually came from Bob. And integrity. No one has messed with Bob's message, on its way to me. So this highlights there are two main types of encryption that we think about typically. Symmetric encryption, so that's where we have a shared key or a password. Everybody has to have that shared knowledge to access to encrypt or decrypt. And then we have asymmetric, which uses a public-private key pair. And so that means I can publish my public key, people can encrypt data for me using that key, and only the person who possesses that matching private key can decrypt that data. And we see that's a very common thing to use in a lot of systems. So when we talk about usability encryption, we have to say that it's not usually a default. Typically, all encryption is rooted on some type of good password. Even if you're using public-private key, a lot of times that private key is protected by a password. Users can lose or forget passwords, and then that can ruin things if you're, really going hardcore secure there, which is not something we can put up with in a lot of systems. In a lot of systems, a user has to be able to say, I've forgotten my password, I can prove my identity to whoever runs the system, and they can let me back in. So a classic example of, also, how do you know if you can trust someone's public key? That's a big question. So here's a classic paper. It's called Why Johnny Can't Encrypt. It's about PGP email encryption. It's from 1999, year of all good things. And basically this was a small user study where they tried to get people to use a PGP encryption tool for email on the Mac operating system just to send some encrypted email. Everybody failed at this because it was not a great design. It's still not a great design. It's not easy to send encrypted email. And this wasn't even a test against an adversary. This was just getting people to encrypt a message and send it. And they were sending their own keys and sending unencrypted things. So it's a challenge. You might say, can we just make encryption invisible and automatic? We try to do that as much as we can. But the problem is, how much time do users spend thinking about invisible things? None. And so if there's a problem, users will not realize maybe that things are no longer getting encrypted. So kind of a balance there. This brings us over to an area of passive security indicators and phishing alerts, for example. So we need to indicate to a user that there might be a threat. So our primary example is looking at browsers and whether those are, bars identifying, that the site's not secure, or even more involved visual indicators. So in this case, this is a proposed system using a visual hash on different form fields to verify that they're actually being served from a trusted domain. Still subject to some attacks, but here's kind of the classic ones that we're used to seeing every day. We Google plays with this in their browser. All the browsers play with how they feel about doing this. Also how they present the domain. Do these help? Are they actually useful for a user? I'd argue in most cases no. If a user encounters something they don't like when they're trying to achieve their goal, they're just going to try to get around it if you let them. So we've really got to be careful with warnings. That's kind of the lesson here. So limiting the number of warnings is important, only doing it when we really are sure that something matters. To speak a little bit more about warnings. This is kind of I like this, this example. Some hazards are context dependent. So alcohol can be a hazard on its own. Driving can be a hazard on its own. But when you mix them together, that context really, that's a bigger hazard. In a similar way, when we start to do security dialogues and notifications to users, realize that every time we ask a user to make an assessment, that is a cognitive burden on them. That's not something they usually signed up to do, and they're going to take the path of least resistance. So we need to be careful about when we intervene, and when we test our intervention systems or our warning systems, we need to test both of these cases, when it's appropriate and when it's inappropriate, and gauge how a user responds to that. I thought this little graphic kind of proved the point. Just click the blue button. We've all been there. You only have one choice if you want to go forward. And a lot of users don't have a mental model or an understanding of what the information we're providing to them means. So typically when we design a warning, we want to attract attention to important information. So an example is like a publisher name of software when we're installing something. We can use attractors like dimming the rest of the interface, making one part bold. We also force a delay commonly. That's a good technique to actually slow a user down before they just click next, next, next. We can force user interaction before certain things happen. I wish all browsers would do this before they started auto-playing something, and I wish Google wouldn't exempt themselves from this in Chrome. But they say that's a mistake, so we'll see. So, examples of this, actually forcing the user to read the publisher name, maybe. And when we test this, when we develop these, we need to see kind of how a user responds to whatever we've come up with. And this brings up humans in the loop in general. So this is a framework that's kind of developed looking at the whole process that occurs when we bring a human in with a warning maybe, and all that goes into how they process that and then outputting their behavior. The lesson here is that without a good mental model and the cognitive capacity to devote to this task, the user will try to get through this as quickly and easily as they can, and that makes sense. So we've got to really think about that as we design things. So we can see here, when we are certain that something is dangerous, we should block it. We should take care of it for the user. We may not even pop up a notification to them. It may be somewhere in some log interface if they really want to get to it. We take care of that. When we're certain that things are probably okay, we don't bother them with that either. It's this middle ground, obviously, where we need to ask the user to help us. And so we need to think about, what information will we present to the user? What are they capable of doing with that? And what are we asking them to do with that? So here's an example. Bad question. Your browser thinks this is a phishing website. Do you want to go there anyways? Most people will probably say I want to go there if they have some goal in mind, and it's easy to just ignore it. It might be as simple as changing the way that we present this message that helps a user make a better choice. They may be more hesitant to choose to go to some site that they didn't intend to go to. And if that's not the case, they're probably more likely to say, oh, I did want to go to this site. Now what happens after this message, that's a whole other story. But it can be as simple as making the content appropriate and helpful. So I want to start talking a little bit about privacy policies. We'll probably need to finish this up on Thursday, but that's okay. So over here on the right, I've got, this is an example of, I think this is a P3P system. When we had this idea that all privacy policies needed to be machine readable so that we could present them in a nice uniform way to users on all platforms. Now, as you can see from this small example, this is a complicated looking table, and I really doubt a user is going to think about it much less try to parse it completely when they're signing up for an account to achieve some goal that they're probably interested in doing quickly. So that brings us to the big issues when we start to talk about privacy policies and how we communicate what privacy policies we follow to a user. So we need the user to understand the policy, and we need them to, the reason we need them to understand it is so that they can actually control their privacy and understand what's happening with their data. The problems, obviously, most people do not read privacy policies. If they do read them, they may not understand them. There's been a lot of work on making friendly privacy policies and communicating privacy information in more consumable ways, and not resorting to these boring, hard-to-read privacy policies, which are, in fact, just poor usability. It's the equivalent of designing some horrible interface. So there's a lot of work in this area. Answering this question here, are there more usable ways to convey a privacy policy to a user? So let's stop here. We'll pick up next time talking about privacy via informed consent. So we'll cover, we just have a few things to cover left on Thursday. And so kind of here's our outline for the week. So on Thursday, I'll post the quiz and next reflection. And tonight, I'll post this project checkpoint information. All of this will be due on Monday. And on Thursday, we'll talk about privacy a little bit, and then we will do kind of a special topic about HCI and the presidential election. Hopefully that will be enjoyable. And then we won't have lecture on Tuesday. So I will see you guys on Thursday on WebEx, and I will post information about the project checkpoint later this evening. All right, I'll hang out for a few seconds. If you have questions, let me know. Otherwise, thanks, and have a great day.